Okay, so welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at a pretty interesting topic,
Yep.
U.S. and Brazil,
Okay.
and more specifically, how U.S. elections
Mm.
can actually impact Brazil. And we found this really interesting quote from one of the experts that we were reading, and it was that the U.S. can almost act like a mirror, reflecting similar societal and political trends that are happening down in Brazil.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
So this whole mirror effect thing, why does this expert think that the U.S. acts in this way for Brazil? Well, we see kind of parallel developments sometimes in both countries.
Yeah.
For example, you have the rise of figures like Bolsonaro in Brazil
Right.
and then Trump in the U.S.,
Mhm.
both of them kind of tapping into this populist sentiment,
Yeah.
challenging the norms.
That's a really good point. I never really connected those two, but it makes a lot of sense when you put it that way.
Yeah, and it's not to say that those two are exactly the same, but there are these interesting parallels in terms of how they rose to power. And also the types of voters that they attracted.
Yeah. So beyond just these figures, why else would this expert suggest this kind of mirroring effect?
Well, for one, both countries have pretty similar systems when it comes to politics.
Okay.
They're both federal republics with a strong president.
Right.
And so that means that what the U.S. president does can really impact how Brazil approaches their own government.
Interesting. Okay. So almost like they're watching us go through something first.
Yeah, you can kind of think of it like watching someone else navigate like an obstacle course.
Yeah.
And then learning from their successes and mistakes.
That's a good way to put it. So it's not just like one leader copying another.
Exactly.
It's more about just seeing how similar systems respond to similar challenges.
Exactly.
That makes a lot of sense.
And then, of course, you have the social and cultural exchange. That's happening.
Okay.
The Brazilian diaspora in the U.S. is massive. So there's this constant flow of ideas and trends back and forth. So what happens politically and socially in the U.S. is definitely going to resonate within those Brazilian communities here in the U.S., but also back in Brazil.
Yeah, that makes me think about those soft power connections that we hear about so much, how cultural influence can sometimes be just as powerful as economic or political influence.
Absolutely. And speaking of economics, we can't forget that the U.S. is Brazil's second largest trading partner.
Wow.
And its top direct investor.
That's a huge connection. So when you talk about the U.S. potentially taking a more transactional approach to international relations,
right?
What exactly does that look like? And what could that mean for Brazil?
Sure. So in the simplest terms, a transactional approach basically means prioritizing immediate concrete gains over long-term strategic partnerships.
Okay.
So this could involve things like, raising tariffs to protect domestic industries or renegotiating trade deals to kind of get a better deal, even if it maybe strains relationships with allies.
Okay, so more like what can you do for me right now?
Exactly, yeah, exactly. Short-term thinking. And for Brazil, that could create some uncertainty and potentially even discourage investment from the U.S.
Right, because they might not know what to expect in the future.
Exactly.
So how would all of this affect Brazilians, like, in their everyday life?
Yeah, that's a good question and a key point. Beyond the economic factors, there's also the impact on the Brazilian diaspora here in the U.S.
Right.
Their lives and opportunities can be directly influenced by U.S. policies on things like immigration, visas, and even things like access to health care and education.
Right, so it's not just this, like abstract idea, it really does have a tangible impact.
Exactly. These are real people's lives we're talking about. And then on a broader level, you have the shared commitment that both countries have to showcasing how successful large-scale democracies can be. The U.S. and Brazil are kind of like two flagships of democracy, especially in the Americas.
So if you're someone living in Brazil and you're looking at the U.S., the way our democracy functions here can really influence how people view democracy there.
Absolutely. The way elections are run, how power transitions, all of that can influence how people view and participate in democracy, not just in Brazil, but across Latin America.
It's like we're setting an example in a lot of ways.
In a way, yeah. If you have a smooth, successful election in the U.S., it can really reinforce people's belief in democracy.
Right.
But then on the flip side, any problems or controversies in U.S. elections can raise doubts about the system as a whole.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So just to recap here for our listener, the U.S. and Brazil, they're deeply intertwined, politically, economically, and socially. And this mirror effect that we've been talking about shows us how trends in the U.S. often have an echo in Brazil, and U.S. election outcomes can have ripple effects on Brazil's economy, its politics, and even its faith in democracy as a whole.
That's a great summary, and it really highlights just how crucial it is for both nations to maintain a stable, mutually beneficial relationship.
Definitely. So, listener, as we wrap up, here's something to think about. If the U.S. really is a mirror for Brazil, what does that reflection tell us about the future of both countries? And what role do citizens in both places have in shaping those reflections? Just something to think about as we navigate this increasingly complex world